Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just going to wait for folks to join. But in the meantime, feel free to put your name and your organization in the chat just so we can see who's in the room. And then I'll be back in about 2 or 3 minutes to kick things off. So thanks for spending your afternoon with us. All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the Community Wealth Building and Chicago Prize 2022 webinar. My name is Nneka Onwuzurike. I am a community wealth building consultant. Many of you, or a few of you, may know me from my work with the City of Chicago with the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. And today I'm here working with LISC Chicago and the Pritzker Chalbert Foundation to bring you this panel and webinar today around community wealth building and Chicago Prize. So I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to spend the next 90 minutes doing. So the goals of this workshop are a few. We want to provide an overview of Chicago Prize 2022. We want to introduce community wealth building, define it, give you some of the core principles and examples. And then we're going to close out with a panel of some local community wealth building practitioners who are going to share a little bit of their key insights and lessons learned from trying to bring to life community wealth building models in Chicago. And so we'll also have an opportunity to answer your questions, both related to the Chicago Prize as well as community wealth building as a whole. So we're going to try to reserve the last 20 minutes or so for audience Q&A. So as you all, I see everyone is putting their name and affiliation in the chat. So for those who are just joining us, feel free to continue to do that. And then throughout this webinar, feel free to ask questions. You can see the Q&A section where you can ask your question there. You're also welcome to put any comments and questions in the chat as well, and we'll do our best to capture them and answer them at the end of this session. So Right now, we've had a little bit of a welcome, and I am going to pass it off to Cindy Mullis, president of the Pritzker Chalbert Foundation, who's going to introduce you to her team and share a little bit about Chicago Prize. So Cindy, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. Thank you, NECA and LIST, for hosting this important conversation. Also to the experts on the panel for sharing their wisdom, and for all of you for joining us. As NECA mentioned, I'm Cindy Mullis. I'm the president of the Pritzker Chalbert Foundation. I know many of you, so I'm looking forward to working together in the future. Our foundation, as you know, invests in expanding economic opportunity to historically disinvested communities in Chicago. And through the Chicago Prize effort, which we launched in 2019, we were able to invest and promote several neighborhoods plans. But as many of you know, we worked most closely with the Chicago Prize 2020 recipient, Auburn Gresham. You'll hear more from Carlos Nelson about their successes and challenges during the panel. So for the last few years, we've talked to many community leaders, many are on the call. You've reinforced for us the ongoing importance of the core mission of the Chicago Prize, which is to invest in leaders like yourself and your bold plans, which are happening on the city's south and west side. We want to provide needed flexible capital to help you execute on your plans. We were thrilled that the Chicago Prize 2020, along with our investment, helped leverage more than $50 million. Today, we're excited to share details about the next Chicago Prize opportunity, Chicago Prize 2022. Pritzker Chalbert has committed an additional $15 million to this effort, and Andy will talk more about the specifics. But in 2022, a lot more has come to light and a lot more people are investing in really important plans. So we're pleased to work alongside other ambitious efforts, such as Invest Southwest, We Rise Together, and even the Chicago Recovery Plan grants, which had a webinar right before ours. We believe that Chicago Prize can be complementary to these other efforts. So please consider sharing your community vision and plans, even if you're also applying to those efforts. I'm joined today by a few members of the Chicago Prize team, Andy Beitman, who will share more information about how to apply, and Noemi Garcia and Michelle Merritt. I want to thank everybody on our team for putting so much work into the launch. A few of today's panelists are also serving as senior advisors to our process, so we're happy that they're part of both Chicago Prize and the ecosystem of what's happening in Chicago. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy now, the Senior Program Officer at Pritzker Chalbert, but I also just want to take another moment to say thank you again for joining today and considering this opportunity, and we're looking forward to working together.
Thank you, Cindy, and good afternoon, everybody. Cindy mentioned my name is Andy Beitman. I'm going to share some slides here. And I have I think the unique privilege to share our Chicago Prize 2020 work with all of you here today. As you saw from the agenda, we have a lot to cover this afternoon, so I'm going to jump in pretty quickly, but I wanted to start with two quick housekeeping matters. The first is everything that I will share today about the Chicago Prize 2020 process can be found in much more depth on our website, chicagoprize.org. And so I've asked Noemi to drop that into the chat and encourage you today and beyond to take a close look at those materials. A second is, we will provide an overview of the process today, but are really eager to get your questions. And so I encourage you to take advantage of the chat feature. Our team will be monitoring, and then we'll use some time at the end of our session here today to go through as many questions of yours as we can. Anything we can't get to or anything that needs further explanation, we'll be providing updates to our website in the coming days to help clarify anything that comes up. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Before we turn to Chicago Prize 2022, I wanted to quickly share a bit of additional context on who we are for those of you that may not be familiar. So we are the Pritzker Chalbert Foundation. This is the family foundation of Penny Pritzker and Brian Chalbert. And as Cindy mentioned, we invest in economic opportunity here in the city of Chicago, primarily on our city's south and west sides. And we have two main strategies that we pursue. One is around workforce, and the other is around community investment, which is what we'll be talking about here today. And as Cindy mentioned, the Chicago Prize is our flagship initiative in our community investment portfolio. We were privileged in Chicago Prize 2020 to commit $14 million to catalytic community-led ideas across our city. And we're humbled and honored at the outpouring of bold ideas we saw, other funders that stepped up to help support this work, and have been especially privileged to partner with Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation and the always growing Auburn Gresham initiative over the last year. Encourage you all to check out our website for a case study of that work. And as Cindy mentioned, we'll hear more from Carlos later this afternoon. We were so inspired by the Chicago Prize 2020 experience. And humbled in many respects by the need we see for still additional investment in community-led ideas on the South and West Side, that our foundation has committed an additional $30 million to this work over the next 5 years, starting with a $15 million commitment to Chicago Prize 2022. And so my goal for today is to start to walk you through what Chicago Prize 2022 aspires to do and be, but we'll start with a video to introduce this work.
Chicago, the city we love. Here, we have dynamic community leaders with exciting plans for change. Neighborhoods and residents ready for equal access to resources.
Andy, if we can see the video.
We believe that a city that works together to lift neighborhoods and people lifts.
We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties, which was not unexpected. So what we'll do then in that case is let's skip the video for now. This video can be found on our chicagoprize.org website, but it provides an overview of some of the information that I'm about to share with you here. So let's go ahead and move forward. So as some of you may know, the Chicago Prize 2020 aspires to support community-led ideas across our city that are using physical transformation to create impact in their communities. And like we did with Chicago Prize 2020, we're starting Chicago Prize 2020 with a big question and a big prompt. And you see it here on your screen, and I'll read it to you. How would you invest $10 million in the built environment to create economic opportunity and build wealth for your community? We want to hear from community leaders, from folks that are on this call, about the changes you want to see in your neighborhoods and your vision for how physical investments, how real estate, how development activities can create meaningful economic opportunity for your neighbors and residents. Within this high-level goal, we have 4 goals that the foundation hopes to achieve through the Chicago Prize 2020 experience. The first, we want to invest $10 million in a transformative community-led initiative that uses physical development to create economic impact for communities of color. Secondly, and as important, we want to also invest $5 million in the pipeline of projects. Third, we want to lead a transparent process that can advise and advance community-led projects regardless of where they are in their journey. From the perspective of the Chicago Prize, we see this work as much as an opportunity to support a single initiative as it is an opportunity to move initiatives across our city forward in a variety of ways. And fourth, and as important, we want to continue to use the Chicago Prize network, process, experience as a platform to both celebrate the work happening across our city and then promote more investment to these projects. Seeking transformative community-led initiatives is a term that gets used a lot and can mean a lot in a lot of different contexts. And so we thought it'd be helpful here to talk a little bit about what we mean by transformative community-led initiatives here in the city of here in the Chicago Prize. And so what you see on your screen are 4 big categories or 4 criterias that we're thinking about as we look at initiatives that might apply to Chicago Prize 2022. They're team, impact, feasibility, and leverage. And so what I'd like to do now is take a moment to walk you through each of these and give you a sense of what we'll be looking for in Chicago Prize 2022 applicants. With respect to team, we think it's important that initiatives are led by leaders of color with an experienced development partner, and the initiative itself must be led by a 501c3. With respect to impact, we're looking for initiatives that are located in a South or West Side community and have a strong, explicit strategy for economic impact, be that through significant job creation, wealth building, or other strategies that community leaders may come up with. Third, we'll be looking at feasibility. We want to see initiatives with a demonstrated path to feasibility and sustainability. We recognize that community development is incredibly challenging and that these are living, breathing initiatives. And so our expectation for applicants is not that they have every I dotted or T crossed, but that there's an ability and a plan to execute. And future webinars that LISC is hosting will talk through this in more detail. We're also looking for projects that are using Chicago Prize funds primarily for project capital or a community wealth strategy. We're not primarily interested in funding programming at this time. And finally, we think context really matters for transformative community-led initiatives. So we're looking for projects that build upon other things that are happening in the community and use the flexible $10 million Chicago Prize Award to attract still more resources. Once again, there's a lot more content on chicagoprize.org that goes into greater depth about these criteria. We've also included a self-assessment on the website where folks that might be interested in applying can evaluate whether this is the right opportunity and where they might want to take their projects. The next question is of course, how does Chicago Prize identify who the recipient will be? We think it's important that the Chicago Prize meet community groups where they are, and we recognize that community development is incredibly complicated and that different communities may have different needs and different opportunities. And so what we've come up with is the three-phase process you see in your screen. We begin with an open call for applications, and this is where we are at this moment in this process. We'll have a business planning phase over this coming summer. And then our goal is to make our awards by December of this year. And our intent is to make 2 categories of awards at the end of this process. One is, of course, the $10 million Chicago Prize. But as I mentioned earlier, we also think it's equally important that we're also investing in the pipeline of future projects. And so alongside our $10 million awards, our trustees, our foundation have committed up to $5 million in other types of planning capacity and development grants for eligible projects. I will walk through each of these pieces in a bit more detail in a moment, but I want to underscore that one of the commitments our foundation is making throughout this journey is to transparency. At each stage along the way, we'll be looking for opportunities to share feedback directly with teams, make connections, refer projects to other funders where there might be alignment, and explore other ways we may be able to advance more initiatives. Let me walk through the details of each phase now. As I mentioned, we're currently in the open call for applications. All the materials that you need to consider and begin to prepare to apply can be found on our website. That includes the self-assessment that I just mentioned. You can also find on our website a very detailed RFP document that goes into a lot of the detail I'm sharing here today, as well as an application template so that you can begin to prepare your application now. On February 15th, we'll open an online portal where you can begin to upload your application. And then the deadline to submit your written application is March 1st of this year. While the written application is a really important piece of our process, we recognize that there are certain limitations to a written proposal. We really want to also understand who the leadership is, their vision for their community. And so following the written application portion, we'll then open it up for conversations with applicants. And I'd like to invite Michelle back to the stage here to share a little bit about how we're thinking about that interview process and what we're hoping to learn through those conversations.
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon to all of you joining today's webinar. As Andy mentioned, I'm Michelle Merritt, and I'm joining today on behalf of a team of diverse local and national experts led by Chicago Trend as one of the many advisors supporting Chicago Prize 2022. For the past year, we've had the distinct privilege of working alongside the PTF team as a thought partner and providing technical assistance and strategic support to Carlos and Norma and Jason and Jay and Erica and the entire always growing Auburn Gresham team as they demonstrate what intentional investment in community leadership and community visions can produce. We also worked closely with the finalist teams in assisting them in accessing their finish line match funding, additional project resources, capacity support, and establishing new collaborations as they continue to advance their projects on behalf of the residents of the Englewood, North Lawndale, Austin, South Chicago, and Little Village communities. I remain in awe of these community leaders and how even during these unprecedented times, they continue to serve both the current community needs and remain steadfast in envisioning a better and equitable future. We've learned so much along this journey over the past year with the teams, and we're equally excited to begin a new journey with the kickoff of Chicago Prize 2022. So I only have a short window of time before I turn the program back over to Andy, and I just wanted to leave you with 2 takeaways. One, during the interview phase of this process, we may meet again, and I'm sincerely looking forward to hearing more about your team's vision, development plans, concepts, ideas for transformative community-led impact. In particular, I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we advance community wealth building for our most vulnerable Chicago residents. I'm sure your written responses will be very engaging, but we can use this interview time to dig into the nuances and the personal stories and narratives that sometimes get lost on paper. Our team will also offer some high-level feedback following the interview that we hope will be helpful. Secondly, Chicago Prize 2022 is really the opportunity to share your big ideas. So go for it. We're eager to hear them. I look forward to one day not being confined to these virtual boxes and actually having an opportunity to meet many of you in person along the way. Thank you. Andy, back to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's continue working through the process here. So as Michelle mentioned, the interview piece that we're anticipating for early spring is a really important part of the Chicago Prize applicant journey. Based on our conversations and what we learned from written proposals, we'll then move into business planning over the summer. Business planning will be a phase that runs from May to September, where we will invite a subset of initial applicants to prepare and provide full business plans to the foundation. So if in the initial phase we were asking for high-level concepts, business planning will be the opportunity to really put down on paper what you want to build in your community, how you'll build it, and how you will finance and operate whatever you want to create. To help you along the journey, the foundation will make significant planning awards to each of the teams that are invited to move into the second phase. And at the end of that process in August, we'll do another round of interviews and site visits, leading to our ultimate award in December, as I mentioned. I want to underscore two key pieces of this process. For those of you that were a part of or learned about Chicago Prize 2022, or I'm sorry, Chicago Prize 2020, you'll recognize really a lot of dimensions of how this will proceed. I want to flag two things that I think are unique this time around. The first is a much more explicit emphasis on community wealth creation. We think it's critical as there's more and more energy and excitement around the strategies you all are leading in your communities to create physical change, that residents and folks in the neighborhood are benefiting from those investments. So that's an area of emphasis that we really want to encourage, and we'll hear a lot more about today in our webinar and future conversations. Secondly, I just want to reinforce that Chicago Prize 2022 is a new endeavor. We have had an extraordinary partnership with the finalists of Chicago Prize 2020 and look forward to working with them for years to come. But this is a new process where all teams will enter at the same place, and we will embark upon this journey together. I want to conclude just by quickly putting this slide up on the screen here. As I mentioned, there is a host of resources available for applicants or potential applicants on our Chicago Prize website, including everything you would need to begin your application today. We'll begin accepting applications on February 15th, and the deadline for your written application is March 1st. In the meantime, we encourage you to continue to participate in conversations like the one we'll have today, follow us on social media, join the Chicago Prize Network, and continue to share questions with us, both in the chat and by emailing us at chicagoprize@ptfound.org. I want to thank LISC and all of you for the opportunity to share this work with you all, and we're really looking forward to your questions in just a short while. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Nneka to take us into our next piece of the conversation.
Thanks, Andy. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll save some time towards the end to answer those. So right now we're going to shift gears. We're going to move over to a community wealth building overview, and then we'll jump into the panel. So I think every conversation about wealth, specifically the racial wealth gap, should be grounded with a little bit of history and a little bit of data, even if brief, like we will do today. One of my favorite quotes that speaks to the racial wealth gap is from Derek Hamilton, who says, "It was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy and to some extent literal government giveaways that provided whites the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth." So there's a very long and well-documented history of the ways in which government and private sector and many others have created policies and practices that have benefited white folks and exploited and extracted from people of color, from the genocide and theft of native land and the transfer of that land to white men, to the enslavement of Africans who they themselves were considered property and assets, to, in more recent years, urban renewal, the destruction of public housing, redlining, and so much more that we won't get into today. But I want to ground that history to say that all of that in the past shows up today in our present, that speaks to the racial wealth gap that we have today, where white families' median wealth is 8 times that of Black families and 5 times that of Latinx families. So what actually is wealth, right? We're going to spend the rest of the day talking about wealth building and community wealth building, but what is wealth? So many of you may be familiar with this definition, that wealth is what you own minus what you owe. So wealth differs from income, right? That comes in and you spend that money on a variety of things. Wealth is really what remains. It's a stock value. And I want to preface this by saying that, no, there's multiple different forms of capital. Financial capital is one, but there's social capital, human capital, intellectual capital. And so there's a variety of things that are a part of what makes one have a full and prosperous life that don't just have to do with money. But because of the huge disparities that exist, because of the history in this country, we will be focusing on financial wealth today. And so when we use that term, that's what we'll be referencing. So why does that matter, right? Why does wealth matter? So there's a lot of reasons why it matters. Wealth provides security during emergencies and unexpected economic downturn. I think we all witnessed during the pandemic, and especially at the start of the pandemic, that folks with wealth were experiencing and still are experiencing the pandemic very differently, where they have the security and the stability that others don't. Wealth also allows folks to plan for the future, right? So not just for your individual future of what you want to do in the next 5 or 10 years, but also thinking about the future of your family, right? Being able to pass down that wealth over to the next generation. Wealth also allows you to accumulate more wealth, right? You can use your wealth to stimulate the development of other assets. You can take on risks like starting a business because you have this nest egg. And then also wealth increases your social influence and political participation. There was a really great political series that came out last month that spoke about the history of large Black owned businesses in Chicago and the ways in which the economic wealth that was being built, the economic power that was being built, contributed to the building and strengthening of political power for the Black community and cultural power as well. And so all of these things we know are connected. So if what you own minus what you owe is your individual or household wealth, then what is community wealth? So we have defined community wealth building as follows. Community wealth building is an approach to economic development that promotes the local, democratic, and shared ownership and control of community assets in order to transform our economy to be more sustainable and just. And so the focus here really is on assets, on community assets, and that they be both community owned and community controlled. So I wanna break down some of those highlighted words just to get a little bit into the detail around what we mean when we say local, democratic, and shared ownership and control. So starting off with ownership and control, those are really the two foundational components of community wealth building, that each of these models really have community ownership, right, which focuses on who owns, and then a community governance component around that focuses on who controls that development. And we believe that both of those two things together lead to self-determination, that leads to the building, strengthening, and sustaining of political, cultural, and economic power. And then we describe those two things, both the ownership and control, with these three adjectives, right? And so this is not an either or, pick and choose. This is really all of these things together, where ownership and control should be local, democratic, and shared. So when it comes down to local, what we mean by local is that the ownership and control is in the hands of the residents in which the development is being built. It's not in the hands of someone who lives somewhere else in Chicago, or maybe doesn't live in Chicago at all, right? Really thinking about the residents of that very neighborhood in which the development is happening. When we say democratic, we mean that the ownership and control is determined by processes that really allow everyone's voice to be heard and acknowledge the existing power dynamics, right? So we'll go into a few examples later on, and also our panelists will speak to this, that there's a variety of ways to kind of structure a democratic ownership and control. Some will say, a one person, one vote model, but there are a variety of ways. But really it says that we're not choosing a model in which only a few voices are matter, right? There's privileged voices who get a say, and there are voices who are marginalized or excluded. And then the third one is shared. So the ownership and control is in the hands of many people. It's broad-based. It's not concentrated in the hands of just one person or just a privileged few people, even if those few people are people of color. It really is thinking about how do we broaden and share both the ownership and control as widely as possible. And I want to underscore, I think, one of the through lines along all of this, and what you'll see as we get into some of the examples, as well as the panelists speak, is that a lot of what community wealth building is about shifting relationships. Oftentimes when we think about businesses, there's the owner and then the employees. Or when it comes to housing, there's the landlord and the residents. There's the leader and the follower. And when it comes to community wealth building, it really is shifting that relationship to say that actually we are all owners here. We all should be owners here. We should all have a say in what the development looks like and how this process goes. So the employees are also going to be co-owners. The residents are also going to own the building, right? And so that's a lot of what you'll see and hear throughout the rest of the day. So what are some of the outcomes of community wealth building? You can see them here. I will say the primary outcome is that local, democratic, and shared ownership and control, that building community power and self-determination. And then there's also a variety of other outcomes, right? So some of these models really focus on community stabilization. How do we use the co-ownership of housing or land to really create permanent affordability models so that we can stabilize the change that's happening, that we're seeing coming on in our community? I also want to note that, household wealth building is also an outcome of this, right? So community wealth is being built, and at the same time, those residents are also building their own individual and household wealth at the same time. So what are some examples of community wealth building? So it's important to know that community wealth building and a community wealth building approach can really be used in any type of asset ownership model. So whether you're looking at business ownership or home ownership, land stewardship, or commercial real estate, you can incorporate a community wealth building approach into what you're doing. And so this is a non-exhaustive list, but here are a few examples here under each of these buckets of what an example of a community wealth building model would be for that. So I'm going to walk through a few examples. So when it comes to business ownership, a worker cooperative is a model where all of the employees are also co-owners. So they own and control the business, and they control it through a shared democratic governance practice, right? Where maybe, for example, it's a one person, one vote. And so as all of the workers are also co-owners of the business, they're able to set their wages. So they're setting thriving wages. And most worker cooperatives have a much higher average wage than the traditional business. They're also all able to reap the rewards of the profits of the business. So they're also getting annual dividends. And so they're able to really grow their financial wealth through not only their income, but also by owning this asset, right? And so here's an example, and I'm excited later on in the panel, we'll be able to hear from Martine of a worker cooperative in Chicago. So Cocina Compartida de Trabajadores Cooperativistas is a worker co-op here. It is a shared commercial kitchen that has 35 cooperative members that really came about from a number of street vendors who were experiencing a lot of barriers and decided that they wanted to create a space, a shared space that shared cooperative principles. And so they were able to acquire a 3,500 square foot space in North Lawndale. They use it for catering, fresh packing and storage. It's available for rent 24 hours a day. And they take turns going into the kitchen and making meals. For example, during the pandemic, they distributed 37,000 meals to community members, all through this idea of we're experiencing some barriers and also an opportunity to build wealth for ourselves and have control over an asset in our community and be able to create this shared kitchen that is serving their community in a number of ways. When it comes to home ownership, an example of a community wealth building model is a limited equity housing cooperative. So this model is a cooperative where there are a variety of members who are members of this cooperative who each purchase stock in that cooperative that owns the housing, and then they also are living in it. And so what's interesting about a limited equity housing co-op is that as a member, a resident member, resident owner, you have shares in the cooperative and you're a co-owner and you co-govern the work of the cooperative. And then also it has a restricted resale value. So when you're ready to sell your shares and move on, it restricts the amount that you could resell it at, keeping it affordable for the next person. So an example of this here locally is the Pilsen Housing Cooperative. Yvonne will be on our panel later to speak a little bit more about it. It's a limited equity scattered site housing co-op that was created in 2017 by and for longtime residents of Pilsen. It is striking this balance of creating long-term affordability for the folks in that community, as well as financial wealth building. An example of a land stewardship community wealth building model would be a community land trust. So I'm going to share an example actually outside of the city in Oakland. And so a community land trust is an organization will acquire and steward land in a trust. And so that trust will be, the goal of that is to really keep that land in the hands of the community in perpetuity. So the trust will own that land and will decide what will happen on that land. So they can decide that they want to use the land for gardening. They can also decide that they want to develop on that land and put, housing or commercial real estate on there. And so one example of that is in Oakland, so the Oakland Community Land Trust. It was founded in 2009 with the initial goal of trying to stabilize housing that was threatened by foreclosure. So they started to acquire various parcels of land. And as part of their portfolio, some of that land has single family homes on it. That makes the homes much cheaper for the family who owns the home because the land trust owns the land beneath it. There's artist housing on there. They actually saved a cafe that was going to close and turned it into an employee-owned cafe. And then they also have 10 parcels of land for community food production and youth job training. And then the last bucket that I'll walk through is commercial real estate. And I'm going to pass it off to Janae in a moment, who will go into a lot more detail around this. But there is a lot of different models of community investment vehicles that really allow community members to pool their capital and have an ownership over property in their community. And so this is just one example of one that is in Portland. It's called the Portland Community Investment Trust that was started in 2017. It's a 29,000 square foot commercial real estate space. I think there's about 26 different units in the space. And residents in the 4 nearby zip codes can invest between $10 and $100 a month to be able to have equity shares in that property, and with a no loss guarantee. So it guarantees that they won't lose their money on this investment. So the residents are able to receive annual dividends. So in the short term, they're being able to reap a financial reward, but then also in the long term, they're seeing their shares appreciate over time as the value of the property appreciates over time. So what they maybe bought at $10 a share today, in a couple of years might be worth $15 a share, which is actually the case that happened in Portland, that they've seen that the share value appreciate. And part of their models that they include a community education component, where each of the investors are required to take an owing to owning class that teaches them about investment. So far, they've had over 300 graduates of that course and investors. The majority of them are first-time investors. The majority of them have a household income of less than $40,000. And so this is not the only way to structure a community investment vehicle. I'm actually going to pass it off now to Janae to speak a little bit more about how you can be thinking about community investment vehicles, but also broadly, no matter what wealth building model you choose, what some of the core components that you should be thinking about are.
Thank you, NECA. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak today to talk a little bit about some of the work that Community Desk Chicago led last year with a number of partners, including some of the folks that you'll hear today hear from today as part of the panel. So we participated and led a learning journey to really sort of look at community investment vehicles. And we're using that term very broadly to really speak about, as NECA mentioned, a way for residents to pool their capital, and in some cases even include mission-driven investors and others to really support their effort to own and control property and really support, their long-term objectives in terms of how they want to manage their assets. So community investment vehicles, again, is really a way of giving community control over ownership. And that ownership could be within any existing asset, whether that's a business, it's commercial property, or it's residential. And so when we did our learning journey, one of the things that was very prominent is that there are some key elements that seem to resonate across all the models that we looked at, including the one that NECA just referenced from Portland. And those 5 elements include purpose and process. So really, who is leading and who's a part of the CIV, and really what's the purpose? And I'll talk about that in a second. Funding and investment. And again, this kind of goes back to my earlier comment of, who's all involved and who's funding this. So as NECA mentioned in the Portland model, they have residents that are allowed to invest, but they also were able to take out a PRI, a program-related investment, from a local foundation to sort of help seed that initial investment. And so these are things you'll have to think about. Legal and governance. So a lot of the legal and the governance structure will control and dictate whether or not dividends are paid, or how the level of control is available to residents and even investors who may be supporting that work. Asset and operations. Again, depending on what assets you have, you really need to think about the types of assets that the CIV will invest and how it will be managed. And finally, external stakeholders. So I'm going to just very quickly, in the interest of time, just go through each of these 5 pieces, and we can definitely share the PowerPoint presentation after today to dig a little bit more into some of these elements. So as I mentioned, purpose and process. So some of the key things that you really should think about when you're thinking about a CIV or just a general community wealth building model is, what is the North Star? And having a very good understanding of what is the purpose and objective of the North Star is really going to drive how you shape the structure and who gets involved. Implementation and construction, community leads. So you really do need to have, some players or actors at the community level that is going to sort of take the lead. And that could be a local CDC, it could be a community organization, or it could be a local institute. These are all things that you need to think about in this process. Design and implementation approach. So again, how are decisions and the CIV design going to be determined? So you need to think about, is it 5 key organizations within the community that's going to sort of take the lead in thinking about this? Or is this a collective open invitation to all members of the community to be involved? And then what is the level of resident engagement and education? So NECA quickly talked about how Portland had an education course that was required of all the residents that were thinking about participating. And then scale and scope. Is this local to a certain radius within the community? Is this citywide? What types of property? So these are all things that you need to be thinking about in the purpose and process of your CIV or ownership model. Next slide. So funding and investment, again, when you're talking about any kind of investment, you have to think about what is the capital stack. So the layers of financing involved in funding the operation, thinking about whether or not you're going to do a community equity raise, is there debt involved, is there going to be grants from philanthropy? So you do have to think about, how do you plan to at least initially raise the capital to start your ownership model or actual direct investment in the community? How is the income going to be generated? So thinking about, is this a situation where you're gaining income from being, you're leasing properties to residents, or you're leasing businesses? How are you earning income off of that particular property? What is the investor's return mechanism? So thinking about, is this a situation where you're structuring an investment vehicle where there are actual dividend returns, or is it something that goes back into the pot for reinvestment? You will need to think about those things. Investment tiers and requirements. So it's also possible that you could dictate how much of investments can be coming in from outside the community versus in the community, and how much of a return that those different levels of investments will receive based off of what you've designed as part of the CIV model. And then finally, thinking about your investment profile. Who do you want at the table? Is it just community investors? Would you want to think about crowdfunding, or what we call sometimes pride investors, which may be folks who are committed to the community and they're willing to provide funding at low cost or no cost? These are all things that you need to think about. And I think you would also want to worry a little bit about how those folks are managed if they're coming from outside the community. And that's all part of the design process. So again, there's much more information on this, but in the interest of time, we'll sort of move on to the next element. Legal and governance, and this is probably very, very important, and it's really driven from when I talked earlier about what is your North Star, because your legal structure really will determine tax implications. It'll also, to some degree, be able to dictate whether or not you're paying dividends out to residents or investors. So, for example, with a 501c3, if you're structured as that as part of this wealth building model, you can't necessarily do dividends or provide dividends to residents. So you really do need to think about what your North Star is and layer in that appropriate legal structure to make sure that you can meet the objectives of what you were intending to do as part of the ownership model. Compliance and governance, these are all things, again, depending on your structure, there are legal implications that you have to think about, as well as just your general commitment to control within the community. Next slide. Assets and operations, again, depending on what type of asset you're thinking about, whether it's housing or it's commercial or it's an investment in the business, all of those property types and project types need to be considered. Who's your end user? And then ultimately, how are you going to manage and operate the particular project? And then finally, external stakeholders. We saw this a lot in all of the models. One of the things you do want to think about is not only your community and those particular investors, you also want to think about those external stakeholders and the folks who can really support you in moving your projects forward. So what is the role of philanthropy? How can they support you in meeting some of those objectives for your wealth building model? Whether that is supporting loan loss reserves to help small businesses who you may want to occupy the building that you're purchasing. How can municipal agencies support you? So if you're thinking about acquiring vacant properties, is there a way, as you're structuring your investment vehicle, that you're working with the local municipality to get access to those properties on a first look basis? And then other policymakers. So again, thinking about all of those folks that are in the ecosystem that really will impact how your project will perform, and as you're thinking about the long-term impacts of your particular work. So I know we sort of went through this fairly quickly, but in the interest of time, I'm going to turn this back over to Nneka, and we're happy to provide additional information and much more detail behind these different elements as you're thinking about wealth building models. Thanks, Nneka.
Thanks, Janae. And we will be sure to send this deck afterwards, so you'll be able to dig into this more deeply. I see folks are already putting questions in the chat. So as we transition to the panel, feel free to continue to put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll compile them to answer towards the end. So I'm going to bring my panelists on. They're going to join me on stage, and I'll introduce them to you as they come on. So our first panelist is Martin Unzueta. He is the executive director and founder of the Chicago Community and Workers' Rights Org and Cocina Compartida de Trabajadores Cooperativista. Welcome, Martin. Carlos Nelson is the CEO of Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation and part of the winning team from last year's Chicago Prize 2020. Janae DeFeld of Community Desk Chicago, the director of Community Desk Chicago, and also the one of the co-leads on the great research on the community investment vehicles. Ivan Arenas, the associate director at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and also a member of the Pilsen Housing Co-op. And then last but not least, Lanier Richardson, who is a co-founder and CEO of Chicago Trend. So I am going to stop sharing my screen just so you can see all of us on the stage. And I'm going to ask a few questions of the panelists. And I'm going to start off by just asking a question around community ownership. So community ownership, like was mentioned, is a core component of community wealth building. So there are multiple different ways to structure community ownership, especially based on the asset that you have. So can each of you, and let's start off with Yvonne, speak to the ways in which community ownership is embedded into your model, and maybe say a little bit, just as a reminder for folks in the audience, kind of who you are and what your model is.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate being able to talk today about the Pilsen Housing Cooperative, or PICO as we know it. And I want to thank you, NECA, LISC, and the Pritzker Chalbert Foundation for this opportunity. As NECA has mentioned, PICO is a scattered site limited equity co-op for longtime residents of Pilsen that was formed by artists and families that have deep ties to our neighborhood. And we started around 2017 into 2018. And like the neighborhood, PICO is majority Latino. All but one of our current families have Latino householders. PICO was therefore imagined by Pilsen community members for Pilsen community members. We're 100% community owned, community governed, and community operated. And we see the co-op as a stand against gentrification and displacement. So Pilsen Housing Cooperative, we own our buildings, we sell shares to community members. That gives them a right to occupy one unit. Each household or each share gets one vote. And furthermore, the price of our shares is legally capped to maintain affordability far into the future. So our families have been able to gain access to homeownership at affordable prices. The shares cost typically are somewhere around between $61,000 to $158,000. And importantly, that we do that with kind of few barriers. So in other words, it's open to undocumented, to informal income earners, to those who are self-employed, to artists, to vendors, to a lot of what Pilsen really is. And we don't use kind of credit scores in determining who is eligible for shares. We acquired our first building through relationships with neighbors. And in that, which is a 6-unit building, we had $92,000 in collective member equity. And the smallest down payment was $2,000. And therefore, we did $6,000 of fundraising to support that family. And that's how we got to around $98,000 in cash to put down for that building. And importantly, in terms of the community, the seller was also the one who financed us and stayed on the property, became a PICO member. He's lived on that property for more than 50 years. So in this case, community ownership was literally at 100%. And one could say that even our bank, so to speak, is a community resident, and all the money has stayed in Pilsen. Another couple of things to mention, our operations and capital reserve budgets are another aspect of this project that are funded completely by residents. And our community ownership model is definitely a wealth building strategy as well, although we're a limited equity co-op to ensure that PICO remains affordable housing far into the future. Our families do earn equity up to the price of their share, which can be tens of thousands of dollars, and families can pass their share on to their children. So what we see is that our buildings and model of collective ownership builds and strengthens community. We also have an expansion model that makes us a little bit unique. We have always had the goal of growing beyond a single building and are currently under contract for our second building and have families that have already bought their shares for those units. So to sum up, PICO is interested in expanding on this idea of finding solutions and funding solutions from the community and for the community. And we believe we're a testament to the impact of community ownership. It's an expansion of home ownership by longtime Pilsen residents. It's a concrete manifestation of the strength of our community as we see it.
Thanks, Yvonne. That was great. I appreciate you lifting up all those different community wealth building principles, and also kind of speaking a little bit to the financing, which can be a challenge for a lot of these models. So some of our panelists will speak to that today as we get into this a little bit. And also just a note that in 2 weeks, on Thursday the 20th at 1 p.m., we're going to have a whole session specifically focused on financial readiness, getting into the capital stack of a variety of different models. So just stay tuned and mark your calendars for that. So I'm going to go to Martine next. Martine, can you speak to the community ownership component of the shared kitchen?
Yes, hi, thank you for having me here. Well, the shared kitchen is called Cocina Compartida de Trabajadores Cooperativistas. In short name, we say CCTC. It's easy. This CCTC is owned by 35 members of the community. All of them are street vendors. In 2015, we could pass a new ordinance in the city of Chicago that allow street vendors to sell on the street. Not before 2015, we doesn't have a law to permit the street vendors to sell on the street, but now we have. And one of the requirements of the street of the new ordinance says that street vendors needs to produce all the meats or meals that they are going to sell on the street in a kitchen with permit. So we decided to rent a building, and in the last year, March 2021. 2021, in March 2021, we have the opportunity to buy the building. So this building now belongs to the street vendors that are part of the cooperative. So in this year, we also are going to buy a tamale machine. So this tamale machine is going to come from Mexico, because any other country in the world produce tamales. Look, just the Mexican. And this machine is going to permit to the cooperative to sell cheap the tamales to the memberships, so they can resell the tamales and get some profit for the selling tamales. And these tamales are going to be produced in hygienic and very careful for the very careful in the production of the tamales. And also in this last month, we are asking to buy a lot that is next to the kitchen, because we have the idea that maybe we can build a greenhouse in order to produce very good products and cheaper products, in order to put in the tamales. So cheaper tomatoes and different species that we use in the tamales. So we are going to produce that in this lot. So that is our plans in the Chicago, in the Cocina Compartida. But also I would like to say that we are working with Illinois Workers Cooperative Alliance. That in 2018 we could pass a law in the state of Illinois that now the cooperatives has their own registration in the state of Illinois. So cooperatives now are part of this of the communities if they want to make a cooperative. So Illinois Workers Cooperative Alliance is working on the laws, and also we can give it to any person that would like to make a production cooperative to be part of us. And well, okay.
Yeah, thank
it's
you.
a lot of information over there.
Well, I think that's a really important policy change too, right? To create an environment to allow more of these models to thrive. And I also appreciate you naming, you know, the origins of this work really came from street vendors who experience barriers, right? And I think, you know, Yvonne even mentioned too with PICO, you know, there's a lot of folks who are experiencing barriers to housing, right? And the ways in which these models are able to structure themselves to say, you know, we're going to be able to be open for folks who are undocumented, and like the ways in which we want to structure it to specifically target folks who experience a lot of barriers to owning businesses or owning their homes. And so I want to go to Carlos next on this to speak to the ways in which the Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation was able to structure an ownership model into the project.
Great, and thank you for having me. So allow me to opine. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know, one of our guiding lights is we are the winner of the CP 2020, the inaugural Chicago Prize Award, was, you know, we knew that non-for-profit organizations are critical, you know, to our region's economy as we seek to overcome structural, as you've mentioned, Anika, structural racism and the wealth inequalities, as well as the myriad of social determinants of health that our communities have been plagued with for generations. However, many of of our not-for-profits continuously struggle to secure the funding that enables us to address these challenges. And so as we really designed our proposal for the Chicago Prize in 2020, the racial wealth gap was one of the things that always resonated with us. Additionally, and your presentation was so apropos as we conclude the season of Kwanzaa and the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa and self-determination really stood out in your presentation. African Adinkra symbols is something that we've utilized and continue to utilize in Auburn Gresham as reflecting art as an economic development tool, but also determining how our communities can grow for us, by us, and we can address all of these unfortunate inequities. And so what we were able to do is bring a confluence of community benefits together and complementary ideas in our Chicago Prize presentation. So if you're not familiar, Andy showed it earlier, there is an urban agricultural farm with education campus, 9-acre farm on this renewable energy campus. It is also anchored by an anaerobic digester, which over years it's expecting to make a significant amount of money as a for-profit venture. And then thirdly is the repurposing of the Auburn Gresham Healthy Lifestyle Hub, a 60,000 square foot building that has sat ominously vacant on 79th Street, steps away from Halsted for more than a quarter of a century. Those 3 projects were really focused on sustainable growth, to address the long-term economic needs, local jobs, healthy living, healthy lifestyles to improve neighborhood access to medical care and healthy food, physical and mental activity and support. The second was healthy environment to support a clean, more sustainable environment, and transit-oriented development was at the center of all of these projects. And then third, as I mentioned, local jobs, bringing retail to our community. If you're not familiar with Auburn Gresham, it is a retail desert. It's a food desert. It's a health desert. It's it's a desert and so many. It's so arid that have to go miles and miles to access goods and services that other thriving communities have at their avail. Well, in this proposal, GAGDC as the community lead here in Auburn Gresham, the Legacy New Communities program. So, we lead the quality of life planning process of the Auburn Gresham Neighborhood Network, supported by United Way, the New Communities program supported by LISC. What we decided to do was to make certain that community ownership was at the forefront of our proposal. And so GAGDC is the largest investor in the for-profit anaerobic digester. Now, you must understand that prior to bringing these projects together, I didn't know what an anaerobic digester was. Our partner, Green Air Development, led by Jason Feldman and Erica Allen, Urban Growers Collective, they had this idea that they'd been working on for what felt like a decade. And so working with GAGDC on our planning processes over the years, bringing these projects together and making certain that the money that comes out of this for-profit venture comes back to the community, allowing GAGDC and our neighborhood network partners to have access to resources that allow us to do the work that is written out by the community partners in our quality of life plan. So, sorry about that. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of a description of the always growing Auburn Gresham work. And it's really about sustainability and our communities being able to sustain the resources that are generated from these projects.
Thanks, Carlos. And I think I saw Andy post a link to some of the resources on the website that go into a little bit more detail too, if you want to learn more about the project of Always Growing Auburn Gresham, to see a little bit more about the ownership model. I also appreciate you lifting up the Kwanzaa principles, because I think too, with community wealth building, I think the term in and of itself feels fairly new. I think a lot of folks feel like it's gaining momentum right now, but at the end of the day, these principles and these models have been in Black communities and Latinx communities and Indigenous communities for many, many generations, right? And so I appreciate you lifting that up, that a lot of this is, already embedded in the culture of our communities. So Lanier, I'm coming to you next. I want you to speak a little bit about the ownership. Tell us a little bit about the project. Tell us about the ownership structure. And then I want you to jump into the next segment around challenges, right? So what are some of the challenges that you experienced in trying to come up with your ownership structure?
Yeah, and I'll try to speak very rapidly to keep us on pace. So we own 4 community shopping centers, 1 mixed-use property, and have a investment interest in a site that we think will be an industrial center. We have in our community shopping centers 139 Black, local, and small impact investors. I think part of our goal is addressing this. I love the definition that was spoken about earlier. That is, my thesis is wealth is created by owning assets that generate revenue and appreciate over time. And that is not either or, it's and. They're nonprofit models, they're models that are focused on community voice, but they're also models that are squarely focused on creating wealth, income, contract opportunities, small business opportunities intentionally that are not nonprofit. And so our effort is we look for suitable opportunities, we do the analysis, we structure the financing, and then we offer a community of investors, in many instances, intentionally African-American investors, because we're buying property in African-American communities. We allow them an opportunity to invest on the same terms as we do, and own up to 50% of the properties. In some instances, we have 30% Black ownership. In other instances, we have 49% Black ownership. Our last transaction, we have 132 small investors that were secured through a crowdfunding effort, where we put all of the material about the development on the site. Here's what the purchase price is, here's the financial statement, here's the tenancy, here's the financial structure, here's the return expectations that we have and that we hope our investors will have as well. I like to do that 30 more times. Our goal is, could we have an asset base of 100 million or 250 million or $1 billion of assets that are owned by people of color that have an ownership stake, and not, it may include nonprofit, but it's not about nonprofit ownership. It's about people generating revenue they could send their kids to college with and can invest in another business with. And so that's our model. The challenges, timing, right? Moving at the speed of business. When the owner has a property to sell and there's an attractive opportunity, structuring a transaction, securing financing, communicating the vision, identifying investors, all that has to line up in a 30 or 60 or 90-day period. Very challenging. Or finding an owner that's willing to be patient, very challenging. Getting capital, right? Structuring deals that have higher loan-to-value ratios, which will require lower equity, which will facilitate the ownership. We're having an active conversation with philanthropic supporters about supporting our work. And some are understand and will jump in the pool and get it. Others are saying, well, wait, we got to make sure that supporting Black entrepreneurship and supporting Black wealth creation is a charitable purpose, and there's not, incidental, benefit, private annulment or anything. So those type of issues of just structuring deals and timing and financing and doing the legal work to make the transactions work. That's even before we get into operating and hopefully delivering on the expected returns. But our goal is to really do the work, to underwrite the work, in the hope that, I don't know if it's 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, we think it's a long-term perspective that people of color who live in communities will have an ownership stake there.
Thanks, Lanier. Janae, I want to come to you because I know you've done a scan of a lot of models across the country. And also you have a really strong understanding of the ecosystem here in Chicago. Can you speak to some of the challenges that you think that, you know, these community investment vehicles face, or community wealth building models in general face, that you've seen?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Neka. You know, I think that Lanier sort of hit it on the head. I think the one piece that I would say, even as I sort of breeze very quickly through those sort of 5 elements of a CIV, I can't really underscore the complexity of this work. And especially when you start to layer in investors and thinking about the investor profiles and the returns. So I think a lot of what Lanier is talking about in terms of how do you structure the capital stack, and how do you make it affordable for entry into the marketplace for residents who may not necessarily have the same level of equity coming into the deal. I think the other thing that Lanier could probably agree on, because he was one of our case studies for our research work last year, is the educational piece. You know, if you don't come from a household that really understands investments and watch, you know, the stock market, you know, starting to talk about dividends and returns and equity stakes. And I mean, it can be a very overwhelming conversation. And so I think one of the things that we really do have to think about when we're talking about wealth building models, regardless of the model type, is making sure, one, there is a real clear objective to what you're trying to do. So to Lanier's point is own assets and make money. And so I think that if, you know, if some of these are your goals, then everything you do after that needs to be structured to support that. Or is it about neighborhood stabilization? So if it's about neighborhood stabilization, you may not necessarily be as concerned about a resident getting an actual dividend, or what I would often say in conversations, cash in hand. And so I think, you know, having those educational classes and having the community be very clear about what their role is and what their equity stake is and what the benefits of the community are is going to be very critical to being successful here in Chicago.
Thanks, Janae. I'm curious, Yvonne, and then maybe Martine afterwards, to kind of pick up on that community education piece, because I think that's a really critical component. I'm glad Janae mentioned it. So as you all were kind of organizing for PICO and with the shared kitchen, how are you all thinking about education with folks in community? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, happy to do so. And the kind of community governance, the community education piece, I think, and sort of the community ownership, these are important pillars of PICO's community wealth building strategy. And I think this is one of the ways in which Black and Brown communities make those flowers grow in the opportunity deserts, to follow the image that Carlos used to describe Auburn Gresham. And, you know, so PICO, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, PICO's community residents have designed every aspect of the Pilsen Housing Cooperative. We started with potluck dinners at artist Hector Duarte's studio. And over months and now years, Pilsen residents and artists have come up with the idea, have researched co-op models. So we had to do that kind of that education piece ourselves, reviewed legal documents, discussed share pricing options. And every one of those decisions has been discussed by those that are part of PICO, those who live in our buildings. You know, we have worked to come up with a model that's about seeking full consensus for decisions. But in terms of our practical governance, we have a pragmatic consensus model. So all normal business, the contracting for sewer repair, figuring out whether to raise flower beds, voting on the operating budget, must pass a 2/3 majority. And all of the folks that are making those decisions are residents. And we still do have some non-residents on the PICO board, for example, that are part of the original steering committee. But we're moving to an elected representative board where all the board members are elected by residents themselves. And so an important part of that then is this kind of community growth aspect. In the past 4 years, PICO members and residents have learned skills in real estate, in accounting, and property management, and direct democracy. It is a self-help and self-determination model that grows collective empowerment. And so that is kind of built in, that education piece is definitely built in, not just to how we operate, but the success of it, right? In order for it to be fully kind of community owned, you also have to bring people into the work itself and make sure their active stake isn't just in terms of putting that down payment in, but in really being able to understand what it, I think as Janae mentioned, right, what it means to own a building, what it means to have a stake in it, what it means to build that community with others. And that's an important part of, I think, PICO's work and mission.
Thanks, Yvonne. Martine, how about for CCTC? How have you all navigated the community education as well as the governance piece?
Well, I think this is the real difficult part, because so the community that came together with an interest to get some kind of business. This also to understand that the cooperative, for example, needs to be one person, one vote. All the decisions needs to be democratic. All the decisions needs to be discussed by the assembly. There are different levels in the cooperative. So we have some kind of steering committee of the cooperative, and then we have another committee, so like economic committee, and we have economic developer that is looking for grants, etc. And but the most difficult part is put everyone together in the same idea. So many times we need to decide about majority. 50% plus one is something. But one thing that are very helpful in the cooperative is the creation of the bylaws, because in the bylaws you can put whatever what are the role for each one of the cooperativists, what is the role for the president of the cooperative, the secretary, treasurer, what are the roles for 3 or 4 more people that are around the committee, and what are the rights that each one of the members has in the cooperative. So I think that was the most difficult part, but at least in the work in the cooperative and the street vendors cooperative, we are in this process. By the last year we met each week, every Wednesday. And the last Wednesday we met again, and this year, but by the condition of the spread of the COVID, so we decided to make an assembly 2 weeks later. So and all of this needs to be so kind of a democratic discussion with everyone, so convince the people, and that is the difficult part. But and the other thing is that our members, the street vendors, doesn't speak English, so we need to translate a lot of things from English to Spanish, from Spanish to English, but it was really good. I think we are making a very good work in with this cooperative. And also I mentioned, I didn't mention it the last time, that we are working with the Street Vendors Cooperative. We're also with a New Era Windows, that is another cooperative, and we just began to work with RSC Cooperative. That is a cooperative of art in Pilsen, So there are I think there are a movement here in Chicago interesting about cooperatives. So and so all the other things in the community is very good to have resources. It's very good to have allies and make a progress in the community.
Thanks, Martine. Yeah, I can appreciate that. Democracy is great and also takes time and patience. So that can often be the people work, right? I think maybe with most things, the people work is the most challenging part of it. But of course, there are challenges with capital and other things too. So I want to try and do like a speed round. Emphasis on the speed of just 2 final questions, and maybe we can take 2 minutes before we jump into some Q&A. It looks like most of the Q&A are Chicago Prize related. So I want to just give the panelists like a speed round here of what makes a good team, right? So you've mentioned there's a number of things that need to be considered. You need to be thinking about the financial piece, the legal piece, the community education. So I imagine you're all assembling a really strong team to help you navigate all that. So I'm going to pass it to Carlos first, and then Janae afterwards, and then anyone else can answer.
One of the important lessons is you don't know what you don't know. And so obviously it's really important to build a team around you of experienced, professionals, folks like a Lanier Richardson, like a Teresa Prim, like a Janae DeFell. I could keep going on. And so that's so vital. And then the other thing is, don't underestimate the need for legal assistance and strong legal assistance. And so that's part of that whole educational process. I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Janae.
I will ditto what Carlos is saying. And my advice would be, one, don't hire people to learn on your job. And so I think it's very important that you think about, and we're happy to share these resources with you. What are the critical components that it takes to really think about these models, and hire the professionals to do that work. In legal and finance and real estate, I mean, there are professionals that are out there. And the other thing that I would also say is, there are a number of models out here, and we looked at over 30 some models across the country. Those folks are open to having conversations. And it also sounds like even our peers here in Chicago are open. I would strongly encourage you that if you're thinking about those model types, to reach out to those folks and let them help you lean in designing who are the appropriate people that should be at the table.
Okay, and then maybe my last question before I invite Andy back on stage is, what makes a catalytic project? So there's a lot of talk about catalytic projects. And so I would love for you all, and maybe Carlos, will start with you, kind of based off of your experience going through Chicago Prize already and designing an application. What advice would you give to applicants around assembling a project that is truly catalytic for the community?
Yeah, well, certainly don't be myopic. I know we're working on individual projects, but for most of us, it really is about our greater community. AG, Auburn Gresham Always Growing is already showing that it is a catalytic project. It's garnered national attention. In the Invest Southwest priority corridor is right there where the Healthy Lifestyle Hub, Commissioner Cox said he wanted to be as close to the Healthy Hub and the kind of reverberations of what this project is doing. And so our Invest Southwest projects are coming within a block of the Healthy Lifestyle Hub. It's also Catalytic also is attracting resources, private funds, as well as whether it's new markets, tax credits, state, federal funds. And so all these things together. And additionally, there's a metro station that is now coming online. And so it's really representative of what Catalytic is all about here in Chicago's South Side.
Thanks, Carlos, and Janae and Lanier, Yvonne and Martine for being on this panel today. I am going to invite Andy back up to stage, and we can say goodbye to the panelists for now. And we are going to spend the next 7 minutes just answering your questions related to the Chicago Prize. So Andy and Noemi, I'll pass it off to you. And I'll maybe just make one final plug for the next session, and we'll share more in the chat. But the next session, which I saw a few questions around financing, specifically around these models. So we'll speak to a lot of that at our next session in 2 weeks on the 20th. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Nneka. And we'll, with Noemi's help, we will try and best we can address some of the questions that we saw in the chat and were sent to us directly. And again, we will be updating our Chicago Prize materials and FAQs based on what we hear today. And so encourage you all to check back often, and we'll obviously share a recording of today's conversation as well. So Noemi, you want to sort of lead us into the questions?
Yeah, thanks everyone for submitting some questions in the Q&A. There's a question, Andy, about is the orientation of funding, the 10 million and the 5 million, on bricks and mortar development versus programmatic?
It's a really good question. So the Chicago Prize Award itself, the $10 million prize, as I mentioned in our remarks, is primarily oriented toward physical development. What's new this time, and perhaps different than what we said in Chicago Prize 2020, is we've also opened the aperture to both physical development and community wealth building strategies. So for example, Carlos gave a great example how his initiative in Always Growing Greater Auburn Gresham used a portion of their Chicago Prize award to make an equity investment into another development that was happening in the community. So not a direct investment in the physical development per se, but a really clever way to create wealth in the Auburn Gresham community. The $5 million piece that we mentioned is still not programmatic, but much more focused on planning, capacity. We anticipate that in the business planning work, there might be some pre-development work that is happening during that phase, and funds allocated during that second phase of the process could be used for moving your initiative forward in that way.
Can you talk about the partnerships or collaborations between the nonprofit and for-profit applicants, as the process must be led by a nonprofit? Are there specific split percentages that are acceptable or none at all?
That's a really good question, and I think the answer to this question will probably resonate for some of the other questions that were raised in the chat. We think it's really important from the perspective of the Chicago Prize to not dictate certain thresholds or certain types of arrangement. As you all have heard on today's conversation, there are countless different models for what community wealth building could look like in a certain place. And those models depend on who's at the table, what the project is trying to achieve, what the partner's goals are. And so we think it's really important that we not set any hard and fast rules around how those arrangements are structured. What I will say is at the end of the day, what Chicago Prize is interested in is in supporting strategies that build wealth for residents. What that looks like in terms of contracts, in terms of negotiations, in terms of partnership structures, we want to follow your lead as the community leaders and the folks with voice in the neighborhoods to tell us how those arrangements work best for you as you think about pulling these projects together.
Great, I have a question. For the investment readiness criteria, it suggests that there needs to be readiness within 12 months. Can you talk about if that's from the start date of the grant or 12 months from when financing is secured?
This is another question where it's hard for the foundation to or the Chicago Prize to dictate a particular threshold, because we recognize that these are living, breathing projects with timelines that shift, with objectives that shift, that construction is a challenging game and process. What we have said in the Chicago Prize material is that we are interested in the majority of our funds being dispersed within the first 3 years, whether that means an investment ready project that is ready to go the day after the Chicago Prize announced, or one that takes a few more months to get off the ground. It's really important to us that these projects are on the path to moving forward, but the difference between 1 week or the next is not going to be ultimate deciding factor for us.
Related to that, and I think you may have mentioned this in your presentation, there's a question specifically asking if some of the proposed projects should be shovel ready immediately.
Again, this is related, I think, to the last question. We are trying to structure this process in a way that is as flexible as possible in response to the needs and challenges and opportunities of the work that you all are leading. And so again, there's no hard threshold around, what does investment readiness look like? What does shovel readiness look like? I will say that one of the things that we are trying to respond to is a recognition that, like we heard from the folks on the phone today, an enormous amount of planning has happened and is underway, and there are a lot of really exciting projects that are ready to go, but for this infusion of capital. And so we would like to provide those resources. What that translates to, again, in terms of days and weeks and months, we are flexible and want to hear from community leaders.
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple additional questions in the chat about specific areas where development can be. And I would point folks to the website RFP that has specific information about eligible areas.
Yeah, I'll reinforce that point. One of the commitments that we have made in the interest of fairness is unable to answer questions about specific projects, but any questions you all have, obviously we'll record conversations like this one today. Questions we receive through the email account we'll include into the FAQ so that we can be sure that everyone is getting the same information, and we'll be sure to push out updates as they come in. So in the interest of time, NECA, you should let me know if there was anything else on the agenda, but I wanted to once again just put one more plug for our Chicago Prize website, where there's a whole bunch of other information that we weren't able to get to today. I encourage you all to join us for our next webinar on January 20th, which I think will sort of be the next piece of this conversation and get into a lot of the details on the how, which I know we're all eager to hear. So with that, I would love to just again thank LISC for hosting this incredible conversation, thank our panelists for sharing their perspectives and insights, and thank you to NECA for excellent moderation and keeping us on time.
Andy, can you tell people if they have other questions, how they could submit them offline?
Of course, yeah. So you can feel free to reach the foundation at chicagoprize@ptfound.org. I will drop that into the chat right now. Our phones are open, as they say, so please feel free to send in any and all questions, and we will start to circulate updates and answers to common questions as soon as we can. Great. Well, thank you again, everybody. Happy New Year, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.